Welcome to Mortification of Spin, Bully Pulpit, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman, Todd Pruitt, and Aimee Byrd. Mortification of Spin is a weekly podcast from the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. We all find a certain degree of intrigue when thinking about the lives of important men. That's why on this episode of Mortification of Spin, the crew will talk about the life and work of theologian Thomas Oden. At the end of the podcast, we'll tell you how to enter a giveaway for free audio from the Alliance.
Well, welcome to Mortification of Spin, Bully Pulpit. My name is Todd Pruitt. Glad to be here with you as always with Carl Trueman and Aimee Byrd. And we're here to talk to you today about a man and his book. This year, Thomas Oden, the theologian, published his biography entitled A Change of Heart, a Personal and Theological Memoir. And the three of us have been reading it and profiting from it. If you're unfamiliar with Thomas Oden, he's been around for most of the 20th century. He's been a public intellectual and theologian, professor and writer, and has contributed a great deal. Although oftentimes we don't know him and know what he's contributed, he's nevertheless contributed a great deal to the theological discussion within the broader context of evangelicalism. His story is fascinating on a number of counts. He came to prominence as a young theologian in the radical tradition, radically theological as well as social and political. Was a part of the student peace and pacifist movements of the 1950s, complete with banjo and Woody Guthrie songs, and went through a startling transformation, really a kind of spiritual conversion, where he left his radicalism and embraced historic, classic Christian orthodoxy. And so moved from becoming an influential radical theologian to being an influential orthodox theologian. And it's a fascinating story that he tells. Carl and Aimee, what are your thoughts? Any things that you would like to highlight from some of those early days that led him into the fringes of liberalism?
I think it's just stunning how many key liberal and not orthodox thinkers he knew.
Yeah.
He recounts meetings with Rudolf Bultmann. He has tea with Rudolf Bultmann. He's fascinated by Søren Kierkegaard. He's clearly very au fait with Paul Tillich's writings. Mm-hmm. This is not somebody who, took a couple of courses on an MDiv in liberal theology and decided he liked it. This is somebody who was deeply committed to anti-orthodox currents within 20th century theology, manifesting itself also in his activities. He was very involved in the World Council of Churches, very involved in left-wing politics. He was the real deal as far as liberalism, theological and political, was concerned.
Right. He writes about his fascination with Saul Alinsky and has some really terrific anecdotes, but one of his kind of pet projects was to try to appropriate Saul Alinsky into the church, which of course later he reflects on with great chagrin. But he even has a very fascinating anecdote about a bit of triangulation with Hillary Clinton and Saul Alinsky, and I think Hillary is one of Carl's favorite political philosophers, and so I'm sure that was difficult for you to read, Carl.
Unstoppable in 2016, I'm sure, Todd. Unstoppable.
Ready for Hillary. Yeah.
Well, on page 43, he says that what he most loved, the three things he most loved was, and wanted to learn about, was the will to power as taught by Nietzsche, the desire to understand the sexual roots of all behavior as taught by Freud, and the search for radical social change as taught by Marx. So it's just interesting because he also makes the point that he thought that he was being critical and rational, and yet later realized that he was ignoring his best critical abilities and following all these innovative thinkers.
Right. I mean, here's a guy who read and approved of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there was not a single liberal fringe cause that he did not fully embrace and champion.
Indeed, and he's also the man who introduced Wolfhart Pannenberg to reading American feminism. I mean, that is an awesome anecdote.
Yeah. And, interestingly, he references Pannenberg as someone who early on began to challenge some of his thinking. Now, Pannenberg is never going to be known as a stalwart fundamentalist, obviously. He was a German, but compared to where Oden was, Pannenberg was to the right of Oden, and Oden references Pannenberg's interest in historically verifiable facts.
Yeah, exactly.
As a key for him, and Oden was shocked by the fact that it was from Pannenberg that he first heard that there might actually be historical arguments for the resurrection of Christ.
That's an important point, I think, that distinguishes people like Pannenberg and what one might describe as traditional liberals, though Pannenberg's relationship to traditional liberalism is a little more complicated than that. But traditional liberals and conservatives have a common interest in historicity.
Right.
I remember being at the University of Nottingham, my very first job, being involved in a little coffee time debate with two colleagues, one of whom was a radical Barthian, one of whom was a radical liberal. And it was interesting that both myself and the radical liberal agreed on the fact that whether the tomb was empty was an important thing. Mm-hmm. The radical Barthian, it was irrelevant to his faith whether the tomb was empty or not. Right. And I think Oden picks up on that in his interactions with Pannenberg.
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing, of course, is how he comes to his conservative, or starts to move in a more conservative orthodox direction. And that is when he's challenged by a Jewish colleague who essentially says to him, you don't even know the orthodox Christian tradition, your tradition, that you have chosen to reject.
He told him he was densely ignorant in his Christianity, and he couldn't permit him to throw his life away. That's what he told him. I mean, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and of course it drives him back to reading particularly patristic authors, and amazing to tell, he finds many of the answers provided by patristic authors in the specific pastoral context, the context of psychological pastoral counseling, far more adequate than the answers he's been given by Freud and post-Freudian psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. Fascinating story of his move towards orthodoxy.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because along the way, he has these really interesting encounters with various people, whether it's Karl Barth in his hospital room or sitting in a police paddy wagon with Robert Bork. He was the very first guest on Robert McNeil's PBS program that later became the McNeil-Lehrer Report. He was the very first guest to talk about, I believe, was it abortion? Now I'm forgetting. He was a guest with Barbara Walters on her first television program to talk about end of life ethical issues with the I think it was 1975 Karen Ann Quinlan who made I remember as a child my parents talking about Karen Ann Quinlan, who was in a vegetative state, and there were issues about, do we unplug her? And to Barbara Walters brings him on thinking that he's an old-fashioned liberal situation ethicist, because he'd kind of been branded that. And now he's just really started to move in an orthodox direction. And to her surprise, he gets on and upholds the Hippocratic Oath and defends those who are wanting to not kill this woman in a coma. So he has so just the stories that occupy the pages of this book are fascinating.
He tells them in a kind of Forrest Gump like way, I feel like, because there's so much name dropping and so many world renowned people that he meets.
Just kind of comes along.
He acts like he just stumbled upon them all, in his pursuit for truth. And I just love the way he does that, because these stories that you're telling, Todd, and sharing, you don't expect that to be on the next page, but it's one after the other after the other.
Yeah, it's really
does it very, very modestly.
Yes.
But how would we having read the book, on the basis of the book and what we know of Oden's wider writings, how would we assess his contribution and legacy? I mean, I would say one of his greatest contributions has been the revitalizing of interest in patristic authors among evangelicals. And through the Ancient Christian Commentary and Doctrine series that InterVarsity Press have put out, making patristic authors attractive and easily available to an evangelical audience.
Because they weren't even available, really.
That's huge. That's a huge part of Oden's contribution. And it's interesting because even with the life he's lived and the contributions he's made, in many circles he's relatively unknown. And I think that speaks to his humility. I mean, he's still, he's a boy from rural Altus, Oklahoma, that instead of shunning that upbringing of his, he seemed to always treasure it. So instead of staying in the East Coast up at Yale where people thought he should stay, he ends up going back to that region, going back to Texas and Oklahoma. And I think because that's who he's always been, and there seems to be kind of an essential humility about him. But that said, there are contributions he's made that even if you don't know his name, you've felt some of his contributions. And as Carl mentioned, his interest and his love for the patristics is huge. And when I graduated from seminary, I had been schooled in Bultmann and Tillich and Jürgen Moltmann, some Pannenberg, and a lot of Barth. And I started reading his systematic not long after I graduated from seminary, and was very helped by it. Actually gained some clarity on the doctrine of God, where there had been a lot of, unfortunately, some confusion in my seminary education. And Oden helped me in that. He's certainly a big tent kind of evangelical, not that embraces liberalism, but with more of a classic understanding of ecumenism with Protestants and Catholics. And of course, he was a big contributor to ECT, which doesn't thrill us.
Yeah, I mean, his ecumenism is interesting, and on one level it's very attractive, this idea that if we go back to the consensus of the early patristic creeds, that's a good basis for church unity, and I certainly want to affirm that. I think it has, well, if I can say, it has one limitation, but it also offers a particular challenge for contemporary ecumenism or evangelical ecumenism. I think its limitation is that a lot's happened since the early church creeds, and lots happened that is important. So one could reduce his ecumenical proposal to saying Protestants and Catholics need to give up everything that makes them distinctively Protestant and Catholic and become Eastern Orthodox, and we'll all get along. That's a rather blunt way of putting it, but that is the way it's tending. But the second challenge I think it raises for evangelical ecumenism is this. It points us to the foundational nature of the doctrine of God and Christology for Christianity and for ecumenical endeavor. When I look at what I would call informal evangelical ecumenism today, the doctrine of God and Christology really seems to be marginalized and sidelined. Gospel Coalition platforming people like MacDonald and Driscoll, who seem to have a very shaky grasp of the importance of the Trinity. How many modern evangelical leaders affirm the eternal generation of the Son?
Impassibility and immutability of God. And let's not forget that heterodoxy has historically crept into the church when people have tinkered with the doctrine of God more than the doctrine of Scripture. So I think that what Oden does is he does point us towards the foundational nature of the doctrine of God that evangelicals by and large have neglected in favor of soteriology. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that at this particular moment in time, but I would say we need to be careful about dismissing an ecumenism that is rooted in the doctrine of God and then asserting a kind of stadium celebrity-driven ecumenism that marginalizes the doctrine of God and thinks that if you just play to soteriology, you're doing a good thing. And I think that's a question that Oden's legacy raises for contemporary conservative evangelicals that many conservative evangelicals aren't even aware of, let alone addressing at this point in time. Well, Carl, one thing you mentioned before we started recording, which I thought was an important point here, is that, you have a kind of ecumenism when John Piper appears on a stage with Carl Lentz, for instance, at the Passion Conference. That's ecumenism. It's just a bad ecumenism.
And it's more influential.
Absolutely.
Than ECT. It's more influential than ECT. And he gets away with it scot-free.
Yep. Because what's going to happen is because of this Passion Conference that just happened, it's introducing Carl Lentz with the implied endorsement of John Piper to a whole group of people that Carl Lentz hadn't had influence with, and now he's going to, and that's a problem. Anyway, yeah, your point on the value that this has, that Oden's ecumenism has to the doctrine of God, is very well put and timely for us, I think. And maybe in Reformed evangelical circles now, we're ready to once again, after fighting a lot of battles on soteriology when things like the atonement was under attack, we're ready to look again now at our doctrine of God and see if we've dulled the edges there.
Yeah. Well, this book is absolutely fascinating. It's Thomas C. Oden, A Change of Heart, a Personal and Theological Memoir, published by InterVarsity Press. I have to say it's one of the most interesting autobiographies I think I've ever read. Fascinating for its anecdote and also for its implications for contemporary and future church life. And Tom Oden comes across in this book as a very humble and delightful person, which is quite a difficult thing to achieve when you're writing your own autobiography.
Yeah.
But as a team, we would like to recommend this book to you. And also check the blog, because we're all going to be offering our further reflections on this book when this podcast comes out. So we look forward to being with you next time, discussing something else in a casual conversation, that things that count. We'll see you then.
I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming round, just a wandering worker, I go from town to town, and the police make it hard wherever I may go, and I ain't got no home in this world anymore. My brothers and my sisters are stranded on this road, a hot and dusty road that 1,000,000 feet have trod. Rich man took my home and drove me from my door, and I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, Bully Pulpit, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. The Alliance is a coalition of pastors, scholars, and churchmen who hold the historical creeds and confessions of the Reformed faith, and who proclaim biblical doctrine in order to foster a Reformed awakening in today's church. Make sure you visit our website, mortificationofspin.org, to enter the giveaway for the Reformed Biography Series from the 2006 Philadelphia Conference on Reformed Theology. The series features biographies of B.B. Warfield, John Owen, John Knox, and Thomas Boston. Tune in next week to hear the team talk with two Canadian cultural icons.
Honestly, any country that has given us William Shatner, I'm a fan of that country. So,
well, hockey is actually a greater export than William Shatner. Hockey is a real sport, other than this baseball thing that that Americans have going on.
Stop it.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying that hockey is an actual real sport, and baseball, where they're having this World Series featuring two teams from the United States. It's just exhibiting a little bit of hubris, I would have thought.
Hear more next week. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to visit mortificationofspin.org to download your free MP3.
One thing that I thought was really sad, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, was...
This is where he gives up pipe smoking.
Yes!
Yeah, I knew that would hurt you. He makes a big point of that at one
Tobacco
point.
toxicity, you just power through that. When he writes about tobacco toxicity, man, you just push through that.
We need to include that. We got to include that.
No,
Sorry, Todd.
Yeah, I don't know. I would agree, though.